OneD&D messed up Druid. I'm gonna fix it. A few weeks ago, Wizards of the Coast released their Paladin and Druid OneD&D playtest article, and in it they very clearly aimed to make Wild Shape easier to manage for new-time players that were overwhelmed by the sheer quantity and variety of stat blocks that Druids have to manage, especially Moon Druids. However, in the process, they stripped out pretty much all of the creativity from the Wild Shape itself. They simply give you 3 generic stat blocks and say that you can flavor them however you like, totally divorcing the flavor with the mechanics, which is one of the great things about TTRPGs, at least in my opinion. I and many others were not pleased with this change, and a few days afterward I made a short going over the change and pitching a potential rework that I thought would keep with the goals and ambitions of the changes that Wizards of the Coast has presented, while still keeping the creativity of the original Wild Shape. People seemed generally receptive to this short and my idea, so I decided to flesh it out. I don't expect that this would ever be the reality that Wizards of the Coast would go with, but it's a good exercise for me to, go through an idea before I give my feedback on the playtest form. Now, big disclaimer, I don't normally make mechanical homebrew. A lot of my homebrew is settings and lore and writing. Backstories, characters, NPCs, villains, that sort of deal. This is my first real mechanical homebrew on this level. Everything else before has just been like magic items. So while I'm really excited, I did put a lot of work into it and I tried to make it as balanced as possible, but it's my first time. So if you have any feedback on ideas or ways that you would change it, please let me know down in the comments. Alright, well, let's jump into it. Like I predicted in the short, it's going to get a whole lot worse before it gets better. First things first, the stat blocks. I really do understand what they were trying to do here. They were trying to make it easier to manage and just give you 3 stat blocks to choose from. However, I don't think they leaned in hard enough. Let's go even further. Let's make 1 single generic stat block. This is just your Wild Shape stat block, and it will be the base stats for any form you ever turn into. It is mostly based on the OneD&D Animal of the Land, but even more basic. However, don't worry, you also get a whole new suite of options with this stat block. Much like how martials have fighting styles, sorcerers have meta magic options, warlocks have invocations, druids will now have wild features. Look, I went to school for coding, not creative writing. Give me a break. Much like invocations or feats, some of these are level gated and some get stronger as you level up. I think you could go even more intense with the prereq gating, do things like subclasses or other choices within the class, but I didn't want to get too crazy for the first draft. You can choose a number equal to your proficiency bonus. And this is the table. As you can see, there are quite a few of them. I tried to base them all on current 5e creature abilities and level gate them around the time that 5e Druid would get access to a creature that has that ability. It's definitely not perfect, but I think it's about as close as I can reasonably get, especially when we don't know what monsters are going to look like in OneD&D. I also turned all of the new features in the OneD&D article into their own wild feature and added them on the level that you get them in OneD&D. So if you did like those features, they're still here. This allows players to really specialize and customize their Wild Shape in a way that they certainly could not in OneD&D, and even arguably, it's more custom than 5e. Towards the end of this video, I'll be showing off some builds and combos that you can create with this huge list of features. Now let's get into the backing reasoning and logic for why I wanted to change it and why I chose this direction for changing it. I chose this direction to go primarily based off of my experience playing Warlock. In that experience, Eldritch Invocations were a breeze to manage. I only had to worry about the big list when I was leveling up. In-game, it was pretty simplified gameplay. And that sort of seemed to be what they were going for with a lot of these OneD&D revisions to Druid, is making the in-game experience simpler. Now, I think that they totally missed the mark because you still have to give players some choice. They need to have some customizability over the class. Warlock and Eldritch Invocations accomplish this by moving that customization and that choice outside of gameplay. And Druid could do the same thing. And my revision of Druid does exactly this. It places all of those choices firmly out of session where they're not as overwhelming, but still allows you to heavily customize your shape, your experience, and your gameplay when it comes to Wild Shape. This means that there's no time pressure on the choice, but it does take away a lot of the in-the-moment flexibility of Druid, which, unfortunately, I think is pretty incompatible with Wizards of the Coast's goals in this revision. That sort of in-the-moment flexibility is inherently overwhelming if you don't already know the features pretty thoroughly. I also went this direction because I felt like it would free up Druid subclasses, which are oddly constrained by Wild Shape. If you don't know what I'm talking about, 1 out of 7 augments Wild Shape, 3 out of 7 give you things that directly replace Wild Shape, and 3 out of 7 ignore Wild Shape altogether. There are no other subclasses that have this inconsistent of an interaction with the main class's core feature. Channel Divinity is always given by Paladin and Cleric subclasses, even though Cleric has a default option, and 7 out of 8 Bard subclasses all give you ways to interact with Bardic Inspiration in a new way. Alternatively, every Barbarian subclass augments Rage in some way, making it powerful or giving it more options, and most Rogue subclasses give you alternate ways to proc your sneak attack. However, you don't even need to interact with the core feature. Warlock subclasses just don't touch the boons or the invocations. They just completely ignore them, but it's consistent across the board. This is obviously not comprehensive, but you get the idea. Druid is the only one that is so wishy-washy with this. Some subclasses ignore it, others augment it, others just fight for the resource pool. It's weird, and it presents a design decision that makes future Druid content feel odd. Clearly, Wizards of the Coast does acknowledge and understand this. They replaced Wild Shape with the Channel Nature feature. But they relegated Wild Shape to the same position as, Turn Undead for Clerics? It's weird, especially when the entire kind of form of that playtest was around revising Wild Shape. I don't know, it felt incoherent to me. My rework, on the other hand, frees up Druid subclasses to easily interact with the main feature without fully diving into it like Moon Druid. Take the Circle of Wildfire, for example. You could make the base stat block's Bestial Strike do fire damage and make it ranged 30 feet. Boom, you're done. Or you could go even more low touch and just have a couple of additional wild features that each subclass gives you, sort of like how some sorcerer subclasses give you additional spells. You give all of them a nice fire theme and boom, you're done. You don't need to touch it anymore. All in all, I think that this keeps the idea of making Druid in-game play more simple, while still providing a creative outlet for Druid players that OneD&D just does not have at all. It also addresses some subclass hesitancy that currently exists within 5e. Overall, this would solidify Wild Shape as the core feature of Druid. Now, if you don't agree with that solidification, that might just be a difference of opinion, and that might even be a difference of opinion between me and Wizards of the Coast. I did mention that they added some other options for Channel Divinity. Maybe they just want to make Druids more generalized, more like a Cleric or Paladin, where Wild Shape is just the default option for how they use their stuff. That's not how I read it, and that's not how I believe it currently is in 5e, so My rework solidifies it and really brings it into its own as the core feature. Now, let's do some sample combos so that you can see how this would go. So for intro... Hey, Editing Jack here from several days later. I don't know what that dumbass was thinking trying to put that many words on screen in such a short period of time, but rather than have it just be visual soup, I put all of them into this nice Google Doc. Hopefully it's nicely organized. It's much better than trying to find all of the abilities in the main World Anvil article. So you can peruse that at your leisure, see what I was getting at there, and we'll go back to past me to wrap up the video. Are any of these balanced? I have no idea. These are more the combos that I envision players coming up with in order to express the growth of their shape, and they can match this flavor when they wild shape. Or they can just choose random features that they like and be a chimera. Who am I to judge? After all, like I said, I don't really think that this idea would gain enough traction by Wizards or the community to really be taken fully seriously, but that wasn't really the point. When I'm going into this feedback form, I want to be able to look at specific features and say, this is what I don't like about it, and this is how I would do it alternatively. I think that offering them that example, even if the implementation isn't fully balanced, just the idea of it gives them a ton of information on what parts you did and didn't like. Maybe parts that you yourself didn't even realize that you did or didn't like. Until I made this video, and even as I was saying the script, I didn't realize that I didn't like the fact that Wild Shape was becoming a less core part of Druid. That is part of my problem. I didn't realize it when I was first reading the article, but now that I've made this and really centralized Wild Shape, I see that that was part of my problem, and I'll be giving that as feedback on the forum. And that wraps it up. Let me know what you guys thought of this homebrew. It is by far the largest I've ever done, and great experience for me moving forward, but probably wasn't up to the caliber of maybe some other YouTube content creators. So give me some feedback down in the comments. Like if you liked, subscribe if you want more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.